Hello there, this is David from David Books and Comics, and today I thought I'd share a bit about Steve Ditko. Now, Steve Ditko was born in 1927 in Pennsylvania, and he died in June of 2018. And he created a seminal artist noted for his creations, particularly Doctor Strange and Spider-Man for Marvel Comics, and which he co-created with Stan Lee. But he also drew some of the best horror art, which I've shown in previous videos. There's one that I showed from the work he did for Warren magazines, where he did some of his best detailed work. But he also did some excellent work and some very interesting, fascinating work for DC Comics and Charlton Comics. Throughout the time that Steve Ditko was working at Marvel, he was also moonlighting off and on at Charlton Comics. Charlton didn't pay their artists like the two super comic book publishers, DC and Marvel. But nonetheless, a lot of great artists like Jim Aparo and Steve Ditko, Dick Giordano got their start working uh, at Charlton Comics. So I'll show you some of what he did, and I'll explore a little bit about his understanding of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, which he instilled in his later comic book work, especially after he left Marvel in 1965-66. This is the first appearance of the Hawk and the Dove in showcase number 75, one of his unusual creations. The story of, as it says on the cover, two brothers, one very docile and very conscientious, very pro human rights, and also a very good human being. And then there's the tough, challenging Hawk. Um, and they would don their superhero masks and go off and fight bad guys. And if you can see, some of the work in Hawk and Dove is excellent. It's beautiful artwork, actually, and very interesting storyline. If we, let's see who wrote it. I'm not sure who wrote this. I believe it could have been Denny O'Neil, but I'm not sure. So wonderful stuff. So that's Hawk and Dove. That's the first appearance, and this is issue 1. And see, the script is by Steve Skeets, so we can assume that that's who wrote the series. Again, it's some of his best work. He did some later work for Marvel back in the 1980s. Nowhere near as good as the work he did for the DC in the 60s and for Charlton Comics. So I'll show you some of that. This is Captain Atom. This is a series he created, and the writer for most of these stories was Joe Gill. an excellent introduction and backstory and back history of the Charlton line of heroes was written in this archive edition that came out from DC Comics. And there's an excellent introduction by Drake Bell, and in my view, an even better introduction in Volume 2 by Dick Giordano, who really introduced the action hero lines based on based on instructions from the publisher and owner of the Charlton Company, a guy named Charlie, who was John Santangelo, the founder of Charlton Comics, who wanted Dick Giordano and Charlton to compete with the other two big companies, Marvel and DC, and create a hero line. And Dick Giordano was tasked with being the editor, and he brought forth, among these three creations, the Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, and the Question. He brought forth Sarge Steel and Judo Master, which he also helped to ink and drew some of the covers for. And Gunmaster, I think, was also his. Anyway, so Ditko did continue to do work for Charlton after he left Marvel, and he introduced the new costume for Captain Atom, which is this one, and he introduced Ted Cord, a new version of the Blue Beetle. But one of his most interesting creations was, and Nightshade was also his creation. There's the Blue Beetle. There's another Captain Atom. There's number 88. But one of his most interesting creations, as I said, was this fellow here, the Question. And he appeared in the back pages of the Blue Beetle comic book. And so I'll show you some of that. And so this is the Blue Beetle, beautifully drawn, by the way. Again, with all the scope of facial expressions that only Ditko was capable of managing. The artists, despite the page rates that these artists received, he did some very detailed and very expressive, fine work. This is the character. This is the Question. His alter ego is Vic Sage, and he just puts on this blank mask. And here he basically kills his antagonist. And you can see what the mask looks like. Fascinating character. He and this is where Ditko began to explore his own philosophy of what he called objectivism, following on along the philosophical thought of Ayn Rand. Now, Ayn Rand wrote several books, Atlas Shrugged among them, Anthem, I think, is another. But the one I really read that really makes clear what her philosophical thinking is The Fountainhead. And The Fountainhead, as I remember, featured a character named Howard Rourke, who had this kind of, who was an architect, and he had a kind of uncompromising personal integrity, and he wouldn't go with the kind of the trends of architecture of his day. Instead, he wanted to had his own vision and wanted to create his own buildings, and would not compromise on his ideas, even though there were so-called critics who viewed his ideas as too outlandish. Well, Ditko took that kind of thinking to heart, and following Ayn Rand's objectivism, he said A is A, following the concepts that Aristotle first created in his philosophical masterwork called the Physics. And basically what Aristotle said is that a rose is a rose is a rose, and that something that is simply is. You can't just, there's no real subjectivity. In other words, reality exists for what it is. A is A rose is a rose, evil is evil, and good is good. There's no in between. And that's Ayn Rand's interpretation of Aristotle. Subsequent thinkers and interpreters of Aristotle obviously don't take him that way. Ayn Rand did. And so Ditko took that kind of thinking to heart, and he created one of his most famous characters, aside from this fellow. And this is where he really explores. This is a very rough copy of Mysterious Suspense #1. And it's the only solo story of the question. And this frontispiece was Rocky Mastroserio, who was an inker for Charlton, who is much maligned, but I thought he did some excellent inking work, especially in the Captain Atom series. So this is really Steve Ditko's work, and he's the one who is the mind behind this story. Vic Sage is a Howard Rourke type character, uncompromising. He discovers that there's these corrupt officials. He is challenged within his own newsroom to go against his principles. This is the antagonist in the story, this guy. And but he refuses to compromise. We the readers all know, of course, that Vic Sage is right. And it's a really very interesting, very engaging story, thanks to this is Ditko's ideas, but I believe it was Joe Gill who wrote the story. It's very text heavy, as you can see there. And you can see the kind of Ayn Rand type philosophy articulated throughout the text. There's an excellent copy, or Vic Sage actually changing into the question. It's wonderful to read, whether you agree with his philosophy or not. This is an excellent story. And of course, as any good comic book, the hero wins the day. So that's the question. But where he makes his philosophy very stark is when he created this character back in a fanzine called Wit's End, a fanzine. This is from his Fantagraphics publications. And this is Mr. A. And Mr. A dons this mask. He also, like the question, is a news reporter. A news reporter called Rex Grain. And there you can see Mr. A donning his mask. So that's Mr. A. He also created, also along the same lines, this character. It's his name is Static, and first appeared in this Charlton comic, um, and subsequently after Charlton, Steve Ditko published him in this Eclipse comic, and you can see these. I can flip through this. This is the black and white version of the same comic book you saw there. This is all Steve Ditko's own handwriting. He's the one telling the story. Again, similar to Mr. A and the question, he is uncompromising in his. In this case, he's a scientist, and he creates, and then he has this kind of friendly antagonist who is always questioning his philosophy and his thinking. So that's that. That's Static. And this is his subsequent reprints that he himself put out, self-published by Steve Ditko. Features the main character and his Mr. A, but it also features his own creations, among whom are the Void, and just very literally a black and white interpretation of evil. There's no gray, no room for compromise. A gray, if you're in between good and evil, or shady gray, that means you've compromised on values. There's no room for compromise. Object what is evil is evil. There's no deep understanding of the causes, or trying to get at the root cause. There's none of that. His interpretation of evil is that it should be judged and people should be removed from society. Whether you agree or not is not the issue. Um, it's just that's the way he is. Fascinating premise, and it's an interesting interpretation of. It's an interesting interpretation of life. Whether you agree with it or not is not the issue. I think Steve Ditko left a lasting legacy of great artwork. Um, his stories written by other people and some written by himself, like you saw from Mysterious Suspense #1, are excellent. And some of his artwork is some of the best graphic art by any artist. So I hope you enjoyed this little foray into the late great Steve Ditko and his creation, his unique creation of the question. The question has subsequently been written. There was an excellent series created and written by Denny O'Neil, and who and many people who subsequently wrote um, about Vic Sage, the question, really stick to the roots of the character that Steve Ditko established very early on in the pages of the Blue Beetle and in this issue in Mysterious Suspense. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation of Steve Ditko and the question and Mr. A. And and if you did, give me a thumbs up, a like, and thank you all for subscribing. And I appreciate any comments you may have. It's always welcome. Whether you agree with his philosophy or not is not really the issue. I think it's more an appreciation for really and truly a great artist in the medium. All right. Thanks. Bye.